Throughout the Tudor period, many women were sentenced to death and were condemned for their crimes. Some of these were subjected to horrific executions in which they would have their heads taken off by an axeman. But many women would be burnt at the stake for their crimes. Mary I, during her time on the throne, became known for burning heretics and religious criminals. The Tudor period was a time in which there were many changes to the church, and those who could not keep up would often find themselves facing the wrath of the monarchy. But one woman who would find herself taken to Tyburn for her execution was Margaret Ward, and she would, in front of a huge crowd, be executed on the triangular gallows, which became infamous for their use. But what is the story of the execution of the Pearl of Tyburn? Margaret Ward was born in Cheshire around 1550, and she is remembered as the Pearl of Tyburn for her execution inside of the English capital of London. She was a woman who devoted her life to the Catholic faith, and she would not relent, and this would push her towards her execution. Little is known about Margaret's early life, but she did come from a family who were well off and were considerably wealthy for the time, and she would also live in the home of a lady of distinction who was known as Mrs. Whittle in London. Margaret was also married, and she would be a companion to this high-class lady, but whilst she was in the capital, Margaret would learn about the persecutions and suffering of Catholic priests who were being targeted during the religious turbulence of the Tudor period. There was one priest in particular, known as Father Richard Watson, who had been held as a prisoner in Bridewell Prison close to the River Thames. Bridewell had originally been Bridewell Palace, a royal residence of King Henry VIII, and it would be one of his homes during the early part of his reign, and he would inhabit this palace for a period of around 8 years, on and off. But following the king's death, Edward VI then gave the palace to the City of London Corporation, as Henry VIII's son donated it to be used as an orphanage and also a place of correction for female criminals. But then in 1556 it had become a prison, and it was found on the banks of the River Thames, near today where the City of London would be found. The prisons of London, during the Tudor period, were known to be rather brutal and troubling in their conditions, and these were very tough. Possibly the most famous prison in London was the Clink, a site which became known for its torture and the suffering of the inmates. Also, the Tower of London became a royal prison where executions would be carried out. Inside a Bridewell prison, Father Richard Watson had been tortured terribly, and he had even agreed to abandon his Catholic belief and faith, and he would get involved in a Protestant service to make sure he was released, as he was broken. During Elizabeth I's reign, there were many priests who would defy the religious settlement, and these priests would find themselves imprisoned and also tortured. But following his release, Father Watson would go back to the Catholic faith, and he would then be sent back to Bridewell Prison. Margaret Ward had heard a lot about this, and she tried to plan to save the priest and break him out of prison. It was likely that he faced the threat of execution, as he was ardent in his support for Catholicism, and this was against the religious laws and rules of the kingdom. Margaret wanted to prevent his execution, and she went to visit him a number of times, and she would be searched before and after she visited his prison cell. Margaret comforted the priest, and the pair would speak in detail about religion. But Margaret then, as she visited more, would gain the trust of the guards, and she would be searched less often. During one of these visits, Margaret had concealed a rope inside of a basket, and she gave it to Father Watson to allow him to try and escape. But Father Watson did try to escape, but things didn't go to plan. One morning, at around 2 a.m, Margaret Ward and a boatman, who agreed to help the plan, were waiting in the street below for Watson to spring his escape. The priest managed to get onto the roof and climb down, but then he misjudged a rope, and he crashed to the floor. But the rope was left hanging from the window too, and the priest was injured. The boatman who had offered to help Margaret then turned back, and he changed his mind, and Margaret Ward was on her own. A man named John Roche then provided a boat for Watson, and Ward and Roche would later be arrested, The guards of the prison had suspected Margaret Ward, and she was easy to blame, as the priest had very few other visitors. It's believed that Margaret Ward was then tortured for information. She was suspended in the air by her wrists using the manacles, and these would be brutal for someone to experience immense pain. It was said she was flogged and hung up by the wrists, the tips of her toes only touching the ground, for so long a time that she was crippled and paralysed. But these sufferings greatly strengthened the glorious martyr for her last struggle. It's believed she was also beaten with weapons and instruments until she admitted her guilt in breaking the priest out of prison. But the prison guards wanted to know where the priest was, as he could not be found. Margaret Ward also did not give over this information. 8 days later, she was placed on trial. It was said she could not repent her sins for having freed that innocent lamb from the hands of those bloodthirsty wolves. The court did say that she could escape execution if she was involved in a Protestant church service, and to ask the Queen for mercy, but this was not adhered to, and Margaret refused to do this. Because of this, she was found guilty of helping a Catholic priest escape, and she was then sentenced to death. On the 30th of August 1558, just a day after the trial of Margaret Ward, she was then led to the gallows in Tyburn in London for her execution. There were a number of other priests and the boatman, John Roche, who had helped her, brought for their executions, and these were taken first onto the scaffold and were paraded in front of the crowd. Margaret, as she was a woman, would be spared being hanged, drawn and quartered, and she would instead just be hanged on the gallows in front of the large crowd for her crimes. An executioner put Margaret on a stool under the triangular Tyburn gallows, and he placed a noose around her neck before he then removed the stool, and she was left hanging. Margaret Ward was later considered a saint, and she was in 1970 recognised as one of the 40 martyrs of England and Wales by the Pope. She has a feast day with other English women, St Margaret Clitheroe and St Anne Line, on the 30th of August, but her execution would be one of many in the following years, as many people were executed for breaking the later Elizabethan religious rules and laws. Thank you for watching, and to support, please subscribe to Her Remarkable History. Thank you.